agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing good. We just recorded our midweek show, and that was a ton of fun.
Yeah, it was the second time we did that listener choice, listener participation thing, and yeah, I thought it would work out well. I hoped it would. I said it could be a disaster of Hindenburg-like proportions, but that's totally not been the case. It's always like a pleasant surprise to me when things work out even better than my optimistic hopes for them. But yeah, it's been our second one, and I had a blast, and I guess you did too, and I think the folks who were part of it did. So yeah, I'm looking forward to doing more of them. And of course, we have a lot to talk about on today's show. We want to get into some Supreme Court stuff, really kind of from what Trey and Ken talked about last week, maybe our takes on a few things. The National Labor Relations Board and their thoughts on what makes a worker as opposed to a contractor. Pride Month. We are in the middle of Pride Month. I want to talk a little bit about that. The Unabomber. I haven't thought about the Unabomber in a long time, but he died recently, and I think there are some interesting aspects to that, and maybe even more. There is a ton of stuff, and I'm ready to get right into it if you are, Jay.
Yeah, let's go.
So, great. Okay, on last week's show, Ken suggested, Jay, that you and I were kind of operating under kind of a misapprehension, if you will, regarding the indictments against Donald Trump. He seemed to think that we argued that it would have been better for the classified documents indictment that came out last week to come first, prior to that New York indictment that was brought by Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg on those 30-some counts of falsifying business records. And Ken, I think, rightly pointed out that it would be improper for prosecutors to, especially at different levels, to coordinate bringing charges for maximum political impact. And
sure.
Absolutely.
And I was never arguing that
No.
they should. I was arguing that the New York one shouldn't have been brought in the first place.
Yeah, and that was the point I wanted to make. I wanted to make it clear that from my perspective, and what I thought your argument was, neither of us really felt that the Bragg indictment should have been brought in the first place, which is not to say that I don't think I agree that Donald Trump maybe likely falsified business records, but it seems to me that under my understanding of New York law, that would have normally, for anyone not Donald Trump, would have been a misdemeanor on which the statute of limitations would have run out. But what Bragg did was kind of linked it to some campaign finance stuff, turned it into like a class D or E, whatever, felony. So the statute of limitations hadn't run out, and it seemed to rest on some awfully shaky legal ground. And my point was that if you're bringing the first ever indictment against the former president, you don't bring an indictment that's such a novel legal theory or novel-ish legal theory.
Right, sort of bootstrapped and jerry-rigged, together, yeah.
Exactly, which is not to say that I don't think there are some legal issues there, but yeah. And so I just wanted to make that clear that Ken's understanding, I think, of what you and I were arguing wasn't really what you and I were arguing, right?
No.
Okay.
No.
Yeah. All right. So moving on from that again to something that Trey and Ken talked about last week, they discussed the Supreme Court's ruling in Allen versus Milligan. And that's that case in which the 5 justices said Alabama's congressional map likely violates Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And that, of course, prohibits state practices which result in the denial or abridgment of the right to vote based on account of race or color. And I think they had a good discussion of the political implications of this, a good discussion of the extent to which the justices Ken talked about how he felt there was sort of corruption in this decision, which is okay.
Isn't there always? Yeah.
Well, and again, to be cler, Ken's understanding of corruption in this sense is basing a ruling not on the law or any kind of reasonable understanding of the Constitution, but on, I guess you call it, conservative policy preferences. Now, in this instance, Trey pointed out, wait a second, this is not a ruling that's in line with conservative policy preferences, right? And Ken argued, I think, that it was part of a larger effort, basically kind of a strategic concession, just wait until they come out with the ruling on affirmative action, which we thought might happen this week, didn't. And that it's just kind of to set that up, essentially. Say, well, we'll give them a little bit here, we'll take away a lot there. Trey pushed back on this, and I thought he pushed back effectively on this by pointing out that political scientists who study what's called the attitudinal model, and that's that idea that judges base their decision on personal preferences, policy goals, not the law, hasn't really been found to have the kind of explanatory power that at least Ken's argument seems to suggest, right? And Jay, you and I talked about this, and where even though I agree with Ken ideologically and in policy on a lot of things, I fundamentally disagree with him in terms of the bad faith he imputes to the conservatives on the court. And that's, well, we won't re-argue that. But why I'm bringing this up is because in all of what I thought was a really interesting discussion between Trey and Ken on that, what they didn't get into was the dissent in this case. And I think this is important because, 4 justices disagreed with this outcome. And it seems to me that whenever we have a closely divided court on a really important issue like this, I think it's oftentimes useful to take a good look at the arguments on both sides. And so if you're game, Jay, I thought we could do that.
Yeah, let's walk through it.
So let's start with Justice Thomas's dissent. And this was joined by Justice Gorsuch and in part by Alito and Barrett. Now Thomas sort of comes in hot, right? He characterizes this as yet another installment in the disastrous misadventure of this court's voting rights jurisprudence. You don't get to sit on the bench that long with Scalia and not pick up a few things, I guess.
He's seen a lot of installments too, yeah.
But I think the reason he believes it to be so disastrous is that Justice Thomas feels that the Voting Rights Act calls for essentially a system of racial segregation that he sees as incompatible with what he believes to be, I think, what he'd call, in fact, it did, and at one point referred to as a colorblind constitution, right? And more to the point, I think, he argues that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act doesn't actually require that Alabama redraw its congressional districts in such a way that black voters can control a number of seats that's roughly proportional to the black population in the state. That's kind of a judicially designed test, if you will, or mandate, but nowhere will you find that in Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And Justice Thomas says, furthermore, even if that were in the Voting Rights Act explicitly, which it is not, he believes that would be unconstitutional. So
I believe he's right.
So yeah, first off, I guess, would you say that that's a fair characterization of Thomas's dissent, at least the key points? And if so, what do you think about it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair summary, and I think he's right on. To me, I think the issue of that the Constitution somehow guarantees the people that look like you or have the same ancestry or same, common genes or something like that should have a superior claim to represent people in one district. I find that troubling at a very basic level, right? Because to me, that is sort of a abandon all hope, all ye who enter, right? If the idea is that we're going to have a republic where people can vote and they will choose the best person they choose, as opposed to the assumption, and it's a little bit of a racist assumption, isn't it, that people of one race will only want to be represented by people of their same race. Now that may have been true in the past. I don't think current evidence backs it up. And just going back, and look, I'll throw out some Ohio examples. Ken Blackwell, a black conservative from the Cincinnati area, very conservative, won the Ohio gubernatorial primary against Jim Petras, who is a sort of the more traditional, he was a Cleveland ethnic guy. Both of them good politicians. But the idea is the black man won the Republican primary overwhelmingly based on his conservative credentials. So if the idea is, well, these people are voting on the basis of race, well, that would seem not to be the case there. You could point to other. No, again, you want to talk districts and so forth. It's a little bit different.
But I think this gets.
The idea but if the idea is that we have to do this because white voters will not vote for a black man or woman, I think that's an incorrect assumption. And maybe it was correct at one time, but I don't think it is now.
Well, and that gets into the so-called Gingles test, and this is something I wanted to raise because the court has looked at this because Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act talks about the totality
majority districts,
right?
Yeah.
The totality of the circumstance, and basically this comes from a case Thornburg versus Gingles in 1985. A unanimous court put together this 3-part test for Section 2 violations. And very briefly, it's that number one, the minority group in question has to be large and compact enough to constitute a majority in a district. Number two, the minority group has to demonstrate that it's politically cohesive, which kind of goes to your point. And number three also goes to your point. The minority group has to demonstrate that the majority votes cohesively enough to defeat the minority group's preferred candidate, right? And so that's the test the court used. And that's why, in fact, Roberts, the majority the majority ruled against the state here, Alabama here, because they felt like, well, no, what what the plaintiffs were alleging actually met those 3 standards for a Section 2 violation. Now, what Justice Thomas essentially says is that, well, the Gingles test, he feels like this is
throw the whole thing out.
Yeah, he doesn't quite say that, but he essentially says it's not really workable in practice. I think if someone called for it to be overturned, he'd be like, yeah, that's fine. But more broadly, Thomas just feels that if you read Section 2, it doesn't apply to redistricting. It only applies to ballot access and ballot counting because it talks about specifically participation in the political process, not the design of districts. And I guess my point here is that is not I don't find myself in agreement with Justice Thomas on this. Like, I don't find myself in agreement with him on a lot of things, but it is not an unreasonable, untied to any sort of rational understanding of the Constitution, of the law, or legal history sort of interpretation, I guess. A reasonable person can come to this conclusion, basically, is what I'm saying.
4 of them did, yeah.
Yeah. And now 5
if you include me.
Yeah, but there you go. So now Justice Alito also dissented. He was joined by Justice Gorsuch in this, and his argument was a little bit different. He argued that in part, when the race of one group is the predominant factor in the creation of a district, that district goes beyond making the electoral process equally open to the members of the group, which Section 2 requires, but it gives the members of that group an advantage that Section 2 doesn't require and that the Constitution may forbid. In other words, you can't just throw together a bunch of minority voters to create a district that is roughly, to get enough districts that are equal to the population. That district has to be reasonable, right? You can't just make this weird Frankenstein's monster sort of district. And Alito, I think, argued that, well, this district if you create a district just to create a race-based district, that's not okay. It can be a factor. And under Section 2, maybe in some instances it needs to be a factor. But if it is the sole factor, that is not okay if you're doing things like splitting political subdivisions, splitting up communities of interest, which have traditionally been held to be kind of the main things that you're supposed to do in creating congressional districts. Yeah.
No, I think he's right there. Although I would be more on the fundamental Thomas side of that, but I would say he's not wrong there either. Just in time, and this is just from the policy perspective that you and I have kicked this around. That everyone argues that so much of our political problems right now come out of gerrymandering, Part of the Section 2 is responsible for a large bit of that gerrymandering, because it requires this, and the way this works in practice is they carve up and say, all right, we're going to give you so many majority minority districts. That necessarily sometimes means stretching other districts out other places, and you get these again, districts that you get more and more extreme because of the way you draw them up. And if we moved away from this race allocation bit, I think you would see a lot more moderate competitive districts.
Well, let me ask you this.
I mean, that's not a legal argument. That's a policy argument. But.
You alluded to this earlier. In, say, 1965 or 1970, do you think that this made sense as a policy prescription, putting aside any constitutional?
I do. Yeah, I think it made more sense.
And I asked this because this gets to earlier in Shelby County, right? The court invalidated parts of the Voting Rights Act, not really invalidated, but basically said, well, we don't
need them anymore.
Well, you're basing this on data that's 40 years old or something like that, and so this legislation, I don't think, was ever intended to be in place in perpetuity, right? And so reasonable people can disagree as to whether or not it is still necessary. That's why I think that I think Justice Thomas is right in that the Gingles test isn't this like clear sort of just put it into a computer model that generates a result. But I think it's a reasonable test because if you say, well, okay, we have a minority group that is in fact large and compact enough to have to be a congressional district or be a majority in a district and not some kind of weird, bizarro, Frankenstein's monster district. Okay. And that minority group can demonstrate that it is in fact very politically cohesive and that a majority group is also politically cohesive enough to not allow them to select the candidate of their choice. Well, if you can demonstrate those three things, and to be clear, under this test, the burden of proof is on the plaintiff who is arguing that the districts are unconstitutional under Section 2, I'm okay with that. And that's what the majority said here is that, yeah, we applied this test, and I think that's fine. But, you can have a difference. Well, how cohesive is politically cohesive enough, for both the minority and majority group? Well, those are subjective things, but I think they're reasonable standards.
Yeah, I would, again, and maybe this is more legislative argument or more of a we've moved beyond, that this is no longer needed type piece. But yeah, I think you're right. No, I tend to fall into on that third prong where you say, the majority is somehow preventing the minorities, racial minorities, from being able to field candidates or something like that. I think that's where this whole thing just falls apart because I think it just doesn't hold in the real world. But that's not necessarily this case, right? It's you could knock this out on a bunch of other grounds, and that's sort of what Thomas and Alito did. So yeah, but Ken must have been at the Secret Federalist Society meeting, prior to this, where we unveiled the plan to have sneaky Justice Roberts side with the liberals on this one, just to kind of rope them in and give them a false sense of security. So that I'm not sure what follows from that.
Yeah. Well, I will say, I will say that there is an internal logic. If you start by assuming an incredible amount of bad faith or just bad intention on the part of the conservatives on the court, then it all makes sense, right? There's an internal logic to it. I just reject that basic premise. Or even if I accepted that premise, I would suggest...
Well, it would also make sense to say that we faked the moon landing.
Well, I think there are different. No, I think there are different. There are like factual issues there, but I think also then I would argue that it would seem weird to me that this would just be an issue for the conservative justices and not for the justices on the left. So
the justices on the left are the good ones, Mike.
Well, yeah. So I tend to think that, but again, but anyway, that's a whole different argument.
They're not the forces of darkness who are yes. To me, I mean, let's put it this way. I just think that this is the idea that the Chief Justice and other justices presumably would sit around and say, you know what we should do? Let's trick them into, I'll rule on this way on the. I mean, because again, it just doesn't make sense. If you have the votes, you have the votes. And the idea that somehow you're in voting on this, that then somehow, I don't know, you vote differently, separate. I don't get the connection.
Yeah. What I'm saying is I am not saying that Ken's position is factually wrong. We cannot know. Right. But I am saying that I'm not saying it is logically inconsistent because I believe it is not.
The burden of proof would be on Ken to prove facts that would support his claim.
Exactly. And of course, there's no way you can do that given the way the Supreme Court operates. Right. And so that's why I'm not saying that Ken is wrong. I am just saying that I reject the fundamental premise on which his kind of system of understanding Supreme Court decision making is based. That's all.
Yeah. And I just don't understand how it's not like we're hustling pool or something like that, right? You know, we're gonna throw a bunch of games or something like that, so then we'll lure them in and they'll bet more, and I just don't get it. And apparently also I was gonna say last week Gorsuch played his part in the grand scheme by dissenting on another case that involved Indian law. So, yeah.
Well, let's move on to something very different, Jay. This week, the National Labor Relations Board issued a new ruling that will probably make it easier for so-called gig workers to unionize. And the ruling concerns the government's test for whether a worker is an independent contractor and therefore not able to organize, as opposed to an employee, in which case they can't potentially unionize, strike, that sort of thing. And this comes out of, and all of these come in the form of NLRB rulings in cases in which the board, I believe it was 3-1, disagreed with the Atlanta Opera, which was arguing that its hair and makeup stylists who were trying to unionize were actually independent contractors and not employees. And there's been a back and forth here for a number of years between sort of Democratic and Republican appointee majority NLRB boards kind of about how to distinguish between employees and independent contractors. And the point of contention is what's called entrepreneurial opportunity. And this is the ability for workers to make more money on the job, basically, right? And prior to the Trump administration, this was held to be a consideration, but only one among several, including things like employee control of working hours, working conditions, worker supervision. But then in
which has always been the traditional test between a independent contractor and an employee in employment law. There's a whole body of law that is out there on this. Yeah.
And so then 2019, NLRB issues a ruling that says entrepreneurial opportunity is the core of the test and not just one factor among several. It's like the big thing that we're going to look at. And so what this decision does is it basically brings back the rule to what it was before that 2019 decision. And so one entrepreneurial opportunity is still a factor, but just one among many. And not only that, but the NLRB also says, well, we need to think about demonstrated entrepreneurial opportunity as opposed to theoretical opportunity, meaning that, maybe workers could conceivably make more money in their job, but if basically none of them are doing that, then that's not real entrepreneurial opportunity. And the practical import of this means that, like I said, a lot of gig workers, rideshare drivers, home health aides, strippers even, it's going to make it easier for them to unionize. And this is a big deal because there are a lot of Americans who do gig work. I mean, there are numbers vary, right? There was this 2021 Pew Research report. Around 16% of Americans have earned money from an online gig platform. 2018, Gallup kind of looked at gig work more broadly and found that 36% of U.S. workers were in some way involved with it, whether it's a primary or secondary income. So this is, I think, generally seen as a potential win for organized labor. But let's put the political ramifications aside. What do you think about this as just a matter of administrative ruling, administrative law, Jay?
Oh, look, I don't love it. But I think it's probably within the NLRB's authority to do that. I think it's to some extent, is it political? Yes, of course. But no, I'm so again, it's one of these things I don't have terribly strong feelings on. Although the stripper unionization, that's going to be interesting to follow.
Yeah, we will follow it closely. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that would be a good test case to getting better strippers or not.
Well, I mean, but it's, we joke about that, and I don't think we should, at least in some sense, because if you think if you think about the conditions under which strippers and maybe I think a lot of other people in kind of generally the sex work industry work,
the entertainment industry,
there can be some pretty rough conditions. I mean, it's the number one is a potentially very physically demanding job where there are a lot of potentially adverse work conditions. And so, no, I mean, I think this is a group where I could see where folks might feel the benefits of unionizing for better working conditions. And to me, I feel like, yeah, certainly liberal Democratic appointees are going to be more likely to support this. But as a matter of law, as a matter of fairness, it just makes more sense if we're just thinking about what differentiates an independent contractor from an employee. To me, it just makes just common sense to say, well, sure, you want to consider the ability of a person to make money outside of their job. But the idea that you would elevate that to the prime or in their job to the prime factor, that to me is the politically motivated thing that the NLRB did in 2019, not the previous.
No, I think that's a fair argument. I would say, there was a political act, and now there was a political counteract to it. So,
do you think this is going to make much difference in terms of kind of the overall trends and movement we see, to the extent we see any in unionization?
Not a lot. I think the bigger pieces, right, are obviously where you've got states like California that make efforts then to try to statutorily deem gig workers as employees. Now those efforts have come up short. I think I'm trying to know what the status of that, but there have been a number of states. So I think the bigger fight here is not going to be in the NLRB regulatory front. This is going to be, some of it's going to happen, and you'll have regulations that'll rope in more people who otherwise would have been independent contractors. That'll maybe give another piece to sue on or something like that. But I think the bigger fight on this is legislative fight.
Yeah, and I agree. And of course,
I should note that I'm an independent contractor to the politics.
I was going to raise. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So
Jay is not an employee of Politics Guys LLC.
There, it's Unite. We have nothing but our chains to lose here.
Yeah, that would be if you and Trey and Ken tried to organize and unionize, it would be headaches for me. I would, of course, bring in the Pinkertons, the bust that.
You would bring in the replacement workers.
You would expect, yes, it would be. Oh, that'd be a lot of fun. All right, so let's move on to something entirely different. Again, it is the middle of June, right? And June, of course, is we celebrate Pride Month. At least some of us do. And you mentioned, I think, Jay, on the bonus show, actually, that there was a big celebration in Cleveland, right? And there's celebrations
sure was,
all over the place. And this grew out of the 1969 Stonewall riots, which were that response to a police raid of the Stonewall Inn, which is a gay bar in Lower Manhattan, I believe it was. And so in 1999, President Clinton formally declared the anniversary of those riots every June as Gay and Lesbian Pride Month. Now, George W. Bush, the next president, didn't do that, and that was picked up again by President Obama. And then in 2011, Obama expanded the recognition to include the broader LGBT community. Then President Trump declined to continue that recognition, but he did semi-recognize it once in 2019 with, not surprisingly, a tweet. Hey, that's kind of how Trump operated. And now President Biden reinstated the practice of officially recognizing it, but now it's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex Pride Month. And so yeah, there we go. And it seems to me the pattern, Jay, is clear. Aside from that one tweet in 2019, Republican presidents don't recognize Pride Month, and Democrats do. And at one point, I think, well, okay, maybe that's not surprising. I mean, I looked at some data. Somewhere around 72% of LGBTQ adults identify as Democrats, only 17% as Republicans. But then I thought, well, wait a second, though. Both presidents, Bush and Trump, had proclamations for Black History Month, and somewhere like over 90% of Black Americans identify as Democrats. And so I guess I was curious about this. I mean, do you feel like there should be a Pride Month? And if so, do you think Republican presidents should be willing to acknowledge it in at least the same kind of rhetorical way that they celebrate Black Americans with Black History Month?
Yeah. Again, I'm sort of a meh on that. My preference would be that the government has nothing to do with this. If folks want to have a pride parade, I suppose you get the government required permit to hold the parade. And if local officials and whatever want to show up and or national officials, knock yourself out, have a ball. I don't see to me, again, it just strikes me as a little bit weird that I've got to have the government blessing of whatever, someone's sexual preference, gender identity, whatever. I
don't think it's that. I mean, for instance, let me give you an example. Let me give you an example,
okay.
And this is where I'll give credit to Donald Trump. I don't say that a lot,
okay.
But here was his tweet in 2019. As we celebrate LGBT Pride Month and recognize the outstanding contributions LGBT people have made to our great nation, let us also stand in solidarity with the many LGBT people who live in dozens of countries worldwide that punish, imprison, or even execute individuals on the basis of their sexual orientation. My administration, has launched a global campaign to decriminalize homosexuality and invite all nations to join us in this effort.
I think that's a nice statement.
And so I guess what I'm wondering is why do you think it is that was out of those number of Republican presidencies, right? 8 years of George W. Bush and then 4 years of Donald Trump. So that's 12. I can do that math in my head. There was only that 1 year, that one tweet, which I think might have actually been sort of after the fact turned into a presidential proclamation sort of. I don't know, but seriously, I don't know. But I mean, no,
I think the argument is, and has been for a while, and people will get mad at me, but don't get mad at me. I'm not writing the news. I'm just reporting it. I think there is a fair segment of Americans, particularly Republicans, who, from a religious standpoint, believe that homosexual activity and transgender activity and things like that are morally wrong. You can agree with them or disagree with them, right? But that's how they see it. And,
I mean, in a way that being black isn't morally wrong.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. No. I mean, it's that it's. And again, I suppose if you were to ask, the people who are very religiously inclined, they would say, love the sinner, hate the sin, sort of thing.
Except for those people with the signs that say God hates fags, that kind of thing.
Well, those guys, no, probably not. But But to me, what I'm saying is if you're asking, is there a distinction between honoring one group of people, ethnic group, racial group, their contributions to history, versus what some people could see as honoring a lifestyle, with which they disagree, or that they simply feel should not be accorded that same sort of reverence observation. Like, I've never been to a pride parade, but I've seen the pictures. There was once an Onion piece years ago that sort of like, gay pride parade sets back gay rights agenda by decades. That look, a lot of people who, if you have drag queens and feathers and the whole extravagant, flamboyant performance bit, a lot of people just say, look, why do I have to some extent, why does my government have to sort of salute this? Why is a patriot? Now, look, my thing is if you want to go, great. If you want to, be on the front of the float, great. But that if you're asking me why do I think there is a distinction in how presidents have treated this, I think that's the answer.
Right, and because there are a group of people who would say that, well, being black or being whatever, some kind of racial group or ethnic group, that is a state of being you are born into that has no action component. Whereas there's I think like there's this Catholic sort of understanding where like, well, it is there's nothing sinful about being gay,
right.
But it's acting on homosexual impulses.
Yes.
And for whatever reason, God has decided to put this test on you in the same way he puts different. And I don't agree with any of this reasoning, but I'm just saying this is kind of the logic. And you're saying that there are a non-trivial number of Americans who agree with this logic, even if I don't. And that way, if you are a politician that happens to have a number of those Americans in your coalition, you're not going to necessarily go out of your way to anger them with the statement that they will see as sort of honoring that sort of what they think of as a lifestyle choice. Yeah,
exactly. And even from my perspective, as sort of a libertarian type, conservative with libertarian bent, I look at it as, if someone wants to or feels they're born this or whoever, right? Again, knock yourself out. It's none of my business, and nor is it any of the government's business to say that I ought to approve or disapprove of it.
Right. And I mean, it's the government's business in the extent of which, well,
again, provide the police protection if needed so that people don't get beat up. Yeah, absolutely.
But it becomes, it becomes government businesses if there are different rules about whether or not same-sex couples can get married or adopt, or whether or not agencies discriminate against them because they are same-sex couples, that sort of thing. That's government's business. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and that's not because, that's because government has been traditionally tied up in things like marriage. It just is so.
All right. Well, let's move on to we're really kind of.
Although, I mean, let me ask you this though.
Yeah, before you careen.
Well, while we're talking about Pride Month, didn't it used to be Pride Week? But now it's Pride Month.
I don't know.
Is there a sense, because there certainly is a sense on the right, that is it a tad more aggressive this year than it has been in years past?
I don't think so. I mean, I think maybe there are people who are, I don't necessarily, I don't feel myself. And again, most of, I read, every morning. I mean, I look at the New York Post, the Washington Examiner, Wall Street Journal. So I look at a lot, conservative media, but, probably more left of center media, but I don't feel myself bombarded on social media or regular media with pride flags and parades and all that. No one's marched through my living room or anything like that. No one is forcing me to drink beer with pride can sort of thing. So no, I don't think it's been very in your face at all.
Okay.
So
okay.
All right. So Jay, when's the last time you thought about the Unabomber?
Oh, it's been a while.
It has.
Take me back, Mike.
It really does, to the days of our
good old days, wearing flannel, listening to Nirvana. Read
There
about
you
the
go.
Unabomber.
And of course, we bring him up because Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, died by his own hand this week in federal prison, age of 81, I believe. And so this was going back in 1998. Kaczynski, he pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges that were related to these bombings that he carried out that targeted scientists, targeted business figures between the late 70s and the mid 90s. 3 people ended up dead, 23 injured, I believe was the number. He was a really unusual guy. I mean, a genius level IQ, a math prodigy. He had degrees from Harvard, University of Michigan doctorate, taught at UC Berkeley. And then in the late 60s, he just resigned out of nowhere, moved to this remote cabin in Montana, no electricity, no running water. And then he started, not too many years after that, this sort of campaign of mail bomb terror. And it was related.
He's sort of a good character in a Cormac McCarthy
Yeah, he
novel.
really would. Absolutely. Yeah. No kidding. Wow. Good connection there. But all of this was related to his views on modern industrial society. And these were summarized in his 35,000 word essay, Industrial Society and Its Future, usually known as the Unabomber Manifesto. And in 1995, Kaczynski sent this manifesto to a bunch of major media outlets, and he said, hey, he would desist from terrorism, in his words, if a major newspaper printed the manifesto. Now, right away, Penthouse, Bob Guccione, Penthouse said, we'll do it. And Kaczynski said, actually, I want someone a little more respectable than Penthouse. So, and eventually the New York Times and the Washington Post, after they consulted with the FBI, they jointly published the manifesto. And what it basically, it argued that modern industrial society has had serious negative consequences for human happiness, human freedom. It's significantly harmed the environment, and that radical action is needed, with violence as a key component of that action, to kind of wake people up about what's happening. And his view was that the quicker we can force the collapse of this system, which will collapse inevitably anyway, the better off we'll be, because the longer modern industrial technological society continues, the worse the damage both to humans and to the environment is going to be, not just because it's continuing on, but also when it inevitably collapses. And maybe weirdly, I don't know, his influence has actually continued into the present. In recent years, there's been a resurgence.
We honor him still today.
Yeah, I mean, you could find on radical right groups people calling him Uncle Ted and using this kind of romanticization, is that a word? I don't know, of this kind of rural, non-technological life. They kind of tied it into this weird white supremacism sort of thing. And there's also an element on the radical environmental left that kind of embraces his thinking. And Jay, I mean, I know that you and I agree that his methods totally deplorable, right? We are forced strongly against terrorism, mail bombing, all that sort of thing. But
we are.
No question here. But what do you think about his message? I mean, clearly, because like I said, it attracts people on both the far left and the far right. Do you think there's anything that we can pull out of Kaczynski's method or message, not his method, that's worthwhile?
No, I think he was an absolute nut. I mean, I guess that's sort of maybe a simplistic answer, but no, he was. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how much you need to elaborate on to say the Unabomber was nuts.
Yeah, I don't think he was nuts. I disagree. I think he was. I think his reasoning was deeply flawed.
The Unabomber, he makes a lot of good points.
No, I think I mean, I think he did. I think as I read the manifesto, I find myself agreeing with a lot of it. I think where I disagree is that his argument is that the negative consequences of modern industrial society outweigh the positive benefits. I disagree with that. I think as he points out these negative consequences, I say, yeah, that's a negative consequence. I agree. The modern surveillance
How about antibiotics?
Well, I agree that the modern surveillance state can be really disturbing when it comes to human freedom and liberty, right? I agree that things like social media and, which, he is kind of prescient and talk about some of the effects of technology and worker alienation. I see all this stuff say, yeah, these are bad things. But when I weigh the balance, I say, but in balance, I think, antibiotics, all of the things, I think, no, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages. But I also think there are some reforms would be better, but I do not think that a campaign of violent terror is the way to do it. And so that's why I think just dismissing him and saying, well, the Unabomber was nuts and he had no good ideas. No, I think he made a lot of valid points, but he goes off the rails at some point pretty clearly. And that's kind of how I see the Unabomber.
Well, you could say that a lot about anybody. I mean, look, to say, hey, I think we should be cautious in how we treat the environment. I'm concerned about, runaway technology. Yeah, those are all good observations. But it doesn't change the point that, so it's sort of a matter of, well, a stopped clock being right twice a day. Just because he may share some concerns or say, look, let's go back to the 1950s and the John Birch Society, who were tremendously worried about communists and communism and
like as a communist, yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I very much would agree. Communism was a big problem. The spread of communism was a big problem. The totalitarianism of Stalin and the communist regime of the time was horrific, and it presented it was a tragedy for the Russian people, a tragedy for a lot of people around the world, and it was a national security threat to the United States. That said, John Birch Society was still nuts. In that, they were seeing communists behind every tree, and the proposed solution, which I think it's difficult to break someone from say you go to a doctor, right, and the doctor perhaps gets the diagnosis exactly right. But has a really sort of horrific prescription.
Yeah, drink bleach. You got to go back.
Yes,
you got COVID. Drink
looks
bleach.
Like you got some COVID. Here, take some bleach. It's hard to distinguish and say, like, well, that's a really good doctor because he got the diagnosis correct. I've often made the same argument about Marx, right? Karl, not Groucho, but the idea that his diagnosis of that there are haves and have-nots and so forth in society, he's completely right. His prescription to how to fix that problem is completely wrong. And therefore, I would say,
that's fair.
So that's how I look at this is that you can't necessarily separate, just because,
I see.
Hitler was a vegetarian, Mike. you know what I mean? So
but I mean, obviously that wasn't part of his, kind of overarch. But I see your point.
Well, yeah, it was. It sort of was. There was sort of this whole bodily purity.
Maybe so. Yeah, but I guess I see what you're saying in that even if these people, these groups bring up issues that are worth highlighting and talking about, it becomes so difficult to disentangle the awful parts from the good parts that you risk doing more harm than good by using them as a vehicle to raise awareness.
Well, and also there's a whole lot of people that if you've ever had conversations with, they'll start with sort of, some unremarkable premise. And again, let's use like the John Birch kind of thing, like, geez, what's going on in Eastern Europe is horrible. Yeah, I agree. They just marched into Hungary. Yeah. I've heard they've got spies in the State Department. Yeah, they do. That's pretty bad. I think Bob next door is a communist. You know what I mean? Sort of, you start getting, that sort of, I think it's always easy to get sort of trapped in that, with the first couple of propositions that saying, that seems, reasonable enough. And then you get to the, wait, what? And I think that's kind of where, with the Unabomber. So to say, I guess that's my thing is I don't tend to give people credit for, look, they started off with some good ideas, just went off the tracks. I tend to look at where did they end up off the tracks. There was also, it reminds me, Mike, if there was the hilarious, this was before we even really had internet memes, right? People just sort of circulated stuff by email. And I suppose there were web pages, right, that had this stuff. But it was the game of the Al Gore or the Unabomber.
I don't recall that one.
Those?
Okay, huh?
It was sort of, they would have the quotations.
Oh, got it.
Like,
okay, yeah.
Does this come from Al Gore's Earth in the Balance, or is it from the Unabomber manifesto?
I do remember that now, yeah. Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, and also as a conservative, yeah, we kind of look at it that way that I certainly would agree that.
Kind of like Donald Trump or Adolf Hitler kind of thing, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
That you can say environmental awareness and taking care of the environment is important. Is it, but disagree with sort of the primacy that these people would put on that issue.
Well, let's close by talking about the presidential election. I mean, okay, we have 16 months to go, right? But the candidate field, I think, is really filling out. Just this last week, Miami Mayor Francis Suarez, he announced he was entering the race. And if you're counting, and I am, that has 12 major Republican declared candidates, and there are only 3 on the Democratic side. We have kind of one prominent third-party candidate. Cornel West this week announced he would be seeking the Green Party's presidential nomination. There's some other party he's also seeking the nomination sort of thing. But now, I want to be clear, I specified major candidates because all you have to do to be a declared candidate is file some paperwork with the FEC. Jay, you might recall back in 2016. You
were a candidate at one time. You were trying to become a candidate.
I was, in fact. Yeah. And at this point, 941 people have filed their paperwork, including 145 Democrats, 262 Republicans, and 5 communists. Now, if you break that down, though, only 43 of them have receipts of over $200. So that's kind of when it costs nothing, basically, to do it. Now, I think it's fair to say that the Democratic contest isn't really a contest, right? The only real interest there is on the Republican side. Yeah, it's not going to be. But
well, no, I mean, I would argue it's one sandbag away. But go ahead.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, there's always something that can happen, right? To the essentially unopposed. I mean, we're not going to have anti-vax RFK Jr. or Marianne Williamson. They're not going to get any significant number.
Right. Given the current state of play. Yeah. But yeah.
So let's look at the Republican side, though. I mean, like I said, we have, I would say, 12 major candidates now, or at least, significant candidates. When you look at this pool, what does it tell you? What do you see? What are your thoughts on what, if anything, this tells you about the Republican Party and the presidential race?
I think it tells me there is still an appetite for a non-Trump Republican. There's 2 versions of that. One would be sort of the Trump-flavored Republican, like Ron DeSantis, right? That you can bill yourself as, hey, I'm Trump without the indictments. And then there are the folks who would be the more traditional conservative. For example, Tim Scott, who is sort of running in the hope, growth, and opportunity kind of lane, which is kind of where I tend to come out with. Those sort of the lane Marco Rubio tried to occupy sort of unsuccessfully. There's the Mike Pence, which is the more traditional establishment conservative with a splash of Jesus kind of thrown in. And then there's, again, Chris Christie, which is sort of like I guess maybe he's sort of in the DeSantis type lane, right? Of the Trumpy without the indictments, although he's got a specific anti-Trump sort of animus built in. And we'll see how that plays out. I've long said that I think Trump is sort of his own animal, and it's kind of, I think he's worn out his welcome with a lot of the party, just on the, this is sort of a Trumpian thing of winners win. And he hasn't. He's been delivering a whole slate of losses for a long time. So however fervently he believes in the cause, however much he yells about it, however much he's persecuted, and I think he is persecuted, that doesn't mean he ought to be the nominee.
But I mean, it seems to me that he almost certainly will. I mean, there are 12, sure, there are 12 candidates, right? But I mean, there are only really maybe 4, maybe 5 who are going to do anything whatsoever. And it just feels to me like
it's Trump, DeSantis, and then maybe sort of like a
Scott, maybe
somebody coming out of the Scott
Haley.
Or Haley, yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, it just seems to me there's an inevitability to Trump, especially in a crowded field like this, where there's no question that of all of these folks, Donald Trump has the strongest and most committed core of supporters. And the more you split up that field, especially given how the Republican primary rules work, the easier it makes the path for Donald Trump.
Yeah. But nobody's voted yet.
Nope, nobody's voted yet. That's true.
And the fundraising is just beginning. And I do think there's going to be a movement of Republican funders, the more traditional Republican funders, are going to sort of have to say, look, we got to pick a horse, and we got to pick a horse early. And I don't think that time's come yet, but I think it's coming.
And do you expect when that happens, they're going to pick a horse that's not Trump, and that's going to...
Yes. Yeah, and then when I say horse, I mean non-Trump horse. And look, Trump's going to have some money. He's got personally, but he's going to be tied up with a whole lot of other stuff. So
then you don't necessarily, I guess you would disagree with me. I see him as the prohibitive favorite, and you would say maybe not so much.
I'm trying to look down the road. I'm trying.
Sure.
If it's one of those, because again, it's one of those, don't skate to where the puck is, skate to where the puck's going, right? And if you're asking me to skate to where the puck is, I say, well, Trump obviously has the prohibitive lead at this point. As to where it's going, I don't know that he does. I think things look different 6 months from now.
Well, let me ask you this, because I think it would be unfair for me to say, well, if not Trump, who? But if I say sort of, if you were a betting person, if I said Trump or other than Trump as the nominee, and that kind of covers anything that could happen, essentially, would you put your money on Trump or other than Trump?
I would say other than Trump, but it's close.
Okay. I would say...
I'd say like a 55-45, that sort of thing. I think it's close.
Okay. That's fair.
But we've got a while to go. And I do think there's going to be somebody who's going to make the case for winnability of all these people in the field, there's one person that Joe Biden has defeated, right?
That's true. They would say no, actually he didn't. Yeah. Well,
exactly. No, or he tried to defeat him at least. But most people would argue that look, and there's just sort of some basic math that Trump will need to beat Biden. Trump needs to get more votes than he got last time. And I don't see the path to do that. There is certainly a, oh my God, not Biden kind of caucus. And maybe, but I don't think it's that strong among Democrats. I think they'll still vote Biden against Trump, no matter what. So he has to get more Republicans or more independents. And I don't see.
No, I don't. I hope you're right about that. But but that's a whole other issue. And there's still a long way to go. But I guess I certainly would feel a lot better about the state of American democracy and the Republican Party if, say, Tim Scott were the nominee, as opposed to,
sure.
I don't know, I think you obviously would too. That to me would indicate a return to something more like what I would consider a non-Trumpy, non-populist sort of, still conservative, and I disagree with on a lot of issues, Republican Party, but one that I think is not going in what I consider to be a fundamentally wrong direction.
And again, I'm weird in that I'm still sort of, perhaps the last, Jack Kemp Republican type. But Tim Scott would fall into that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and some people, you mentioned the Trump Biden thing and talk about two really unpopular candidates, right? I think it's going to be Trump Biden. And if so, will once again, for the third time in a row, I think, have two incredibly unpopular people running for president. I mean, all right, a majority of Americans, a majority even of Democrats don't want Biden to run again. But even so,
they should do something about it.
But even so, Trump still slightly trails Biden in head-to-head polls. And so, I mean, I guess, so a lot of people are looking at this and saying, well, if there were ever a moment for a serious third-party, no labels type of presidential candidacy, this is it. And in fact, no labels is spending, I think, something like around $70 million in their what they call Insurance Policy 2024 campaign to get ballot access in every state. Now, they're saying right now they will not nominate a candidate to run on those ballot lines unless three criteria are met. Number one, neither major party nominee supports the no labels agenda. Number two, based on rigorous polling, the majority of Americans want an alternative to Trump, Biden. And number three, there's a viable path to an electoral college victory for what they call a no labels unity ticket, which they define as a president and vice president not of the same party unless they're both independents. Now, it seems to me...
Of course, number three is really the only real one.
Yeah, because of course we're not going to... Number one and two are automatic, but...
Because number one or two, you can always just sort of adjust your agenda to whoever you want, and you can determine how rigorous the polling needs to be.
Yeah, but I would say...
reach that conclusion.
I would say even with no kind of gaming of number one and two, those two are almost certain to be met. But number three, I find that incredibly difficult to envision. I mean, so let's talk about what the most potentially vote-getting no labels ticket would be. You're talking probably like maybe Joe Manchin's the person who's most often mentioned, right, as the Democrat. Maybe you pair him with Ben Sass or Glenn Youngkin or Kirsten Sinema or
I could vote for a Manchin Sass or a Manchin Youngkin ticket.
Yeah, you could, right? Yeah. And I think, but that's the point, is that would maybe, you could see a ticket like that maybe getting to Ross Perot levels of support, right? In 1992, Ross Perot won 19% of the popular vote, but he won no electoral votes, essentially.
Yeah.
And in fact, the last time a non-major party candidate won any electoral votes was segregationist George Wallace. He was running as a candidate of the American Independent Party in, it was 1968, I think, and he won 46 electoral votes. So it seems to me, I guess I'm not really clear as to what No Labels thinks it's doing, or there are some folks saying, why would you support this group when essentially that third category is just not going to happen given how our system is structured? Wouldn't it be better to put your time and energy and support into something that actually has a real chance of occurring? And I think they're right. They're arguing it's sort of like a employment opportunity for these kind of old Clinton era political analysts. And that's kind of the folks that are running this thing. And I think, it really seems like a movement without a purpose.
Well, there's always, not to cast aspersions on these folks. So I think their motives I think are probably pure, but there's also one of those that, look, they're getting paid. You know what I mean? There's money to be had, and editorials to be written and TV appearances to be made off of this. Where you go around and say, look, I'm carefully patriotic and this is the right thing to do and all that kind of stuff. And does it really get you anywhere? No, or really get the move the ball in terms of ideologically what you're trying to do. No, but it's a lot of fun, and you maybe make some money along the way. So I think there's that.
Yeah, I think it's no different.
I tend to agree. Look, the only time a third party thing came close to working, and this is, I think, the type of person you need to have, and I don't see that person, would be the election of 1912, right?
Absolutely.
Where
my hero.
Teddy Roosevelt come out of retirement. Yeah. You can say there was sort of something like this in 1952 when the Republican Party drafted Eisenhower. Yeah. Right. That there was sort of some ideological skirmishes here and there. But look, Ike was a hero. Everybody loved him. He was, pretty moderate, sort of easygoing guy, and there was that sort of. But I don't see, maybe back in 2000, was it 2000 or maybe 2000? Colin Powell's name was circulated, that kind of thing. But of course, he's deceased.
Would not make a good candidate for that reason.
Yeah. So yeah,
it would be tough to campaign for him. Yeah.
Yeah. He could stay in his basement though. But if there were some other of that type figure, right? Someone who is well known, has been in government, because I don't think the Ross Perot thing works, right? The outsider businessman, gonna get under the hood kind of thing. Who's the Starbucks guy? His made
Howard Schultz,
past, but that never really got going. I don't see that sort of.
But I mean, Perot would have done better if he hadn't been kind of crazy. I mean, you
can say that about anybody, though, Mike. I mean,
but I guess there are some people who would say, well, maybe there's a scenario where Donald Trump doesn't actually, one of the things that you hope will happen with the party happens, and he's not the nominee, and then he decides he declares, of course, that the entire GOP primaries was rigged and he should have won. He runs as an independent. Yeah. Now that's an independent who you could potentially see maybe picking up a few electoral votes here or there.
Yeah, exactly. But it's so hard to run as an independent.
Which is why we need ranked choice voting. Because now,
I suppose.
Follow my logic.
Baranowski now more than ever. But,
but no, I mean, like for instance, I would be all for this no labels thing in Alaska, Maine, or Nevada because they have ranked choice voting. And so, hey, if you want to vote for, the Manchin SAS ticket, go ahead and do that, because if your second choice then is, whatever it is, well, but that at least registers. And so that's the whole, one of the big points of ranked choice voting. And you could see, this is kind of how my best case scenario where enough states adopt this, where all of a sudden these minor parties kind of get enough publicity and votes and funding over time. And we're talking the course of a generation or more, where they can actually build up the support and the infrastructure to be real challengers, at least at the presidential level, to the major parties. And then you maybe have a shot at breaking the two-party duopoly that's dominated American politics since the Civil War. But absent that, I don't really see any other mechanism through which that's going to happen.
Well, I suppose I see other mechanisms. Yeah, I think I could see other. I think it's doubtful, but again, I would argue that I don't think ranked choice voting necessarily fixes that problem. It's sort of you can get the beef, the salmon, or the chicken, and sort of then the result is shut up, everybody gets the chicken. So I don't know. I'm just
yeah. Well, we have had, and we won't get into that, but especially at this point,
whole other thing,
and we have a basic disagreement about that, but yeah. So in the end, though, I think we do agree on that. There is approximately a zero likelihood of a non-Democrat or Republican being the next president of the United States.
I wouldn't say zero.
Approximately zero.
I would say less than 10%.
Approaching zero.
Approaching zero.
All right. Well, I will take that note of agreement. Yes. And we'll close actually on that note of agreement. And thank you for listening. If you're not already a supporter, we hope you'll consider becoming one. If you are, you get ad-free versions of all the shows we put out. You get our full supporters midweek show. You only get a preview of that if you're not a supporter. There's our Discord group, which is always a lot of fun. And then, of course, the $10 a month above or more, there is also that opportunity to be a part of that midweek show, at least when JRR doing it as it goes on. And so that's a lot of fun too. To check it all out, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us on Venmo or @politicsguys or through PayPal. And as always, the support links, you can find them in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you talk up the show, share episodes, subscribe. rate and review. Let folks on social media know that you like the Politics Guys. They should listen to the Politics Guys as well. And also, if you'd like to get the midweek show, but you're not in the position to financially support us, not a problem. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will make sure you get access to the full midweek supporters show. And as always, we really appreciate all of our listeners, but a special thanks to our fantastic executive producing team. Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, and Ivan English. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.